Disingenuous grandstanding is tiresome, but we have tolerated it out of a sense of camaraderie and mutual respect as P5 members. We have stood by this member state through every conflict in which their freedoms have been imperiled. And today, I remind them that it is the United States that remains the beacon of liberty for the world. As such, we will not be affording them the benefit of listening to their politicized drivel until they renounce their condescending and disrespectful rhetoric and behave in a manner commensurate with their seat on this council. I thank you.
July 28, 2026, the United Nations Security Council, the most powerful diplomatic body on Earth, is holding an emergency meeting on Russia's war in Ukraine. France's ambassador Jerome Bonifant is speaking. He's criticizing Russia's invasion. He's calling for accountability. He's doing exactly what the Security Council was created to do: address a threat to international peace and security. And then the United States delegation stands up and walks out in the middle of France's speech. An ally, a fellow permanent member of the Security Council, the United States of America, one of the 5 nations that wrote the rules of this institution, simply left the room. No explanation, no protest, no statement, just silence and empty chairs. The BBC reported it as a diplomatic incident, but it wasn't an incident, it was a symptom, a visible, undeniable symptom of a body that has stopped functioning. Because here's the truth that nobody in that room wants to admit. The UN Security Council cannot stop modern wars, not because it lacks the authority, not because it lacks the resources, but because it was never designed to. It was designed in 1945 by 5 nations who gave themselves the permanent right to say no to anything that threatened their interests. And in 2026, 81 years later, those same 5 nations are still saying no. The United States walked out of a meeting about a war it cannot stop. Russia vetoed every resolution about a war it started. China blocked every attempt to address a war it profits from. And the Council, the supposed guardian of global peace, sat there paralyzed while the world burned. But to understand why this happened and why it will keep happening, I need to take you back to 1945, to a hotel in San Francisco, and to a deal that was supposed to be temporary. The year is 1945. World War II has just ended. 51 nations gather in San Francisco to create the United Nations, a body designed to ensure that the horrors of the last decade never happen again. But there's a problem. The 5 major powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, the United Kingdom, and France, refuse to join unless they get special privileges. They argue that without the ability to block actions that threaten their national security, they would never agree to be bound by the decisions of smaller nations. And so, Article 27 of the UN Charter is born. The veto. The permanent 5, the P5, can block any substantive resolution with a single no vote. The argument at the time was simple. The great powers need to agree on matters of international peace and security. If they disagree, the Council cannot act because acting without the great powers would mean war with the great powers. It was a cynical argument, but it worked. The problem is that 1945 was 81 years ago. The Soviet Union no longer exists. The British Empire is gone. France has been through 5 republics. China has undergone a revolution. The United States has fought a dozen wars, but the veto power remains exactly as it was written in 1945. And here's the part that should make you angry. The 5 permanent members are the only people on Earth who can change this. Any reform of the Security Council requires the agreement of 2/3 of all UN member states and ratification by 2/3 of those states. But it also requires the consent of all 5 permanent members, which means the people who benefit from the veto are the only people who can abolish it. They will never abolish it. And they have proven this again and again for 81 years. Let me show you what the veto has actually done. Since 1945, the permanent members have cast over 300 vetoes. But those numbers don't tell the real story. The real story is where the vetoes land. Russia and the Soviet Union before, it accounts for the majority of all vetoes ever cast. Since 2011 alone, Russia has vetoed 18 resolutions on Syria. 18. Every single attempt by the Security Council to address the Syrian civil war was blocked by Moscow. The result? Over 500,000 dead. 13 million displaced, a humanitarian catastrophe that the world's premier peacekeeping body was powerless to stop. But Russia isn't alone. The United States has used its veto to block resolutions criticizing Israel over 40 times since 1970. In 2024 alone, the US vetoed 2 resolutions on Gaza as the death toll climbed past 40,000. And in 2026, as the Iran war raged, the pattern repeated. On April 7th, Russia and China vetoed a resolution to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. On May 7th, the US proposed another resolution on Iran, and it was clear from the start that China and Russia would veto it again. The Security Council report, an independent research organization, documented the escalation. In 2024, there were 8 vetoes, the most since 1986. In 2025, there were 4 more. By April 2026, the Council was so paralyzed that the General Assembly, the body with no enforcement power, had to step in and debate the closure of the Strait of Hormuz because the Security Council couldn't act. Think about that. The General Assembly, a debating society with no authority to enforce anything, was the only UN body capable of even discussing the crisis. The Security Council, the supposed guardian of international peace and security, was completely, utterly irrelevant. And it wasn't an accident. It was by design. And then came July 28, 2026. The emergency meeting was called to address Russia's war in Ukraine, a war that has now been raging for over 4 years, a war that has killed hundreds of thousands, a war that has displaced millions, a war that the Security Council has been completely unable to stop because Russia, one of its 5 permanent members, is the aggressor. France's ambassador spoke. He criticized Russia's invasion. He called for accountability. He did what diplomats are supposed to do. And the United States walked out, not because they disagreed with France, not because they support Russia. They walked out because the meeting was meaningless. Because everyone in that room knows that no resolution will pass. Because Russia will veto anything that condemns its actions, and the United States will veto anything that criticizes its allies, and China will veto anything that threatens its interests. The walkout wasn't a protest against France, it was an admission of defeat. A silent acknowledgement that the Security Council has become a theater, a stage where diplomats perform the rituals of diplomacy, while the wars rage on outside. And this is the pattern that defines every major conflict of the 2020s. In Ukraine, Russia is both the aggressor and the judge, vetoing every resolution that condemns its own invasion. In Gaza, the United States is both the ally of one side and the gatekeeper, vetoing every resolution that calls for a ceasefire. In Iran, China and Russia are both the strategic partners of Tehran and the blockers, vetoing every resolution that attempts to de-escalate the conflict. In every single major war of our time, at least one permanent member of the Security Council is directly involved and uses its veto to prevent the Council from acting. The system is not broken. It is working exactly as it was designed to work. Every few years, the UN holds reform talks. Every few years, nothing happens. In January 2026, the General Assembly held its latest round of Security Council reform discussions. France, one of the P5, gave a speech calling for ambitious reform. Germany published a detailed Q&A on why the Council needs to change. The Civicus Lens published an article titled UN Security Council Reform or Irrelevance. Everyone agrees the system is broken. Everyone agrees it needs to change. And nothing changes, because reform requires the consent of the 5 permanent members. And the 5 permanent members have zero incentive to give up their power. The Better Order Project proposed 3 reforms: changing the Council's composition, limiting the veto, and introducing automatic charter reviews. The Security Council report published a 202-page analysis of veto reform options. The German Foreign Office outlined specific proposals for expanding permanent membership to include countries like Japan, Germany, India, and Brazil. None of it will happen, because any reform requires a 2/3 vote of the General Assembly and ratification by 2/3 of member states. But it also requires the consent of all 5 permanent members, and any one of them can veto the reform itself. The veto protects the veto. The Council on Foreign Relations, one of America's most respected think tanks, published a backgrounder on the Security Council. Their conclusion was devastating. The UN Security Council is the premier global body for maintaining international peace and security, but it faces steady calls for reform to better meet 21st century challenges. That's diplomatic language for, it doesn't work and nobody can fix it. But here's the truth that nobody in those reform talks wants to admit. The Security Council can't stop modern wars because modern wars don't look like World War II. The Council was designed for a world where wars were declared by nations, fought by armies, and ended by treaties. A world where the great powers had the authority to enforce peace because they were the ones who had just won the war. Modern wars don't work that way. The war in Ukraine is a war of aggression by a permanent member of the Security Council. Russia invaded Ukraine, and then Russia vetoed every resolution condemning the invasion. The aggressor blocked the response. The system was designed so that the aggressor could block the response. The war in Gaza is a war where the United States, another permanent member, vetoed every resolution calling for a ceasefire. The ally of one side blocked the response. The war in Iran is a war where China and Russia, 2 permanent members, vetoed every resolution aimed at de-escalation. The strategic partners of one side blocked the response. And on July 28, 2026, the United States walked out of an Emergency Security Council meeting, not because they had a better plan, but because they had no plan at all. because the Council had become a stage where the rituals of diplomacy are performed while the real decisions are made elsewhere. In every single major conflict of the 2020s, at least one permanent member of the Security Council has been directly involved and has used its veto to prevent the Council from acting. The UN Security Council cannot stop modern wars because it was never designed to stop wars involving its own members. It was designed to stop wars between smaller nations, and only when the great powers agreed on the outcome. When the great powers disagree, the Council doesn't just fail, it becomes irrelevant. And that's where we are in 2026. The Security Council is not a peacekeeping body. It's a theater where the great powers perform diplomacy while the wars rage on outside. The Strait of Hormuz is still contested, Ukraine is still fighting, Gaza is still burning, Iran is still launching missiles, and the United Nations Security Council, the body with the primary responsibility for maintaining international peace and security, can do nothing. Because 5 nations sitting in a room in New York have the power to say no, and they will keep saying no for as long as the system allows them to. If this breakdown showed you a side of the UN that the mainstream media never covers, subscribe. Because we don't report the news, we investigate the systems that make the news possible. In the next video, I'll break down exactly how Russia has used the veto to shield itself from accountability for the war in Ukraine, every single resolution, every single vote, and the diplomatic theater that allows a permanent member to be the judge of its own crimes. You won't find this analysis anywhere else on YouTube. Subscribe, hit the bell, and I'll see you in the next one.